Hi, everyone. This is Jason Burack of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back for another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a first-time guest. You see him all the time on Fox News, Fox Business, and also on Rumble on Steve Bannon's War Room. He is a PhD economist at the Heritage Foundation. EJ Antoni, thank you for joining me.
Jason, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, EJ, we're recording this interview on Wednesday, March 5th, 2025. We just had the major Trump speech last night. I saw your interviews on Bannon's War Room and also on Fox recently in the last few days talking about inflation. How much inflation were there? How much inflation was there, in your opinion, in the last 4 or 5 years under the Biden administration? Because correct me if I'm wrong, didn't the M2 money supply at one point from 2020 to 2022, didn't it go up by 40%?
Yeah, we've seen pretty much all of our measures of the money supply absolutely explode over the last several years, really beginning in 2020 with COVID. Now, there's a couple of reasons why we didn't immediately get an inflationary shock. Some of that has to do with simply the fact that whenever you inject money into the economy, there's always a lag. Monetary policy is infamous for long and variable lags, in fact. So it's not surprising that in the first month or two, you wouldn't see any difference in prices. But when you talk about the sheer volume of liquidity that we added to the system, you would have certainly expected that by the end of the second quarter or sometime in the third quarter of 2020, you would have started to see a significant impact. And a big reason why you didn't, Jason, was you have to ask the question, what were people doing with all that money? In fact, a lot of them, and it's not just people, a lot of the money that the government had borrowed wasn't even being spent. Yes, the government spent too much money in 2020. I don't mean to make any excuses for that, but a tremendous amount of the money that the government borrowed, they simply just left as cash in the Treasury's account at the New York Fed. And what were people doing? They were paying down credit card debt and other debts too. But all of these things essentially countered the Federal Reserve's additional liquidity that they were adding to the system. And so by the time you get to 2021, that's why you haven't really seen a big uptick in prices at that point. And that's despite all kinds of problems with supply chains and whatnot. So what you then have, though, in 2021 is all of a sudden it all begins to reverse, right? So now people are no longer paying off credit cards. Instead, they're going back to spending on their credit cards. The government is not simply holding cash in reserve because they don't know what tax revenue is going to come in at. Instead, they're just spending all of that money. And that's why by the time Biden leaves office, by the way, the Treasury's cash account is $1 trillion less than it was when he took office. They literally just spent that extra trillion that the government borrowed in 2020. So how much did the money supply grow, though? It's a really good question, and it depends on how you want to measure the money supply. In the same way, Jason, that when we ask how much was inflation during the Biden years, it depends on how you want to measure it. Believe it or not, inflation is a really tricky thing to measure, at least in the short term. Over the long term, it becomes easier. It's still not an exact science because things change over time. A car today is very different than a car 100 years ago. I mean, it's very different than a car 20 years ago, quite frankly. But 100 years ago, it's basically apples and oranges. And so you have to make what we call hedonic adjustments, where you adjust for quality. So again, it's very, very difficult to measure inflation, especially in the short term. And when we look at official measures that the government uses, things like the Consumer Price Index, we find that prices went up over 20% in just 4 short years. That's pretty devastating. The dollar losing a fifth of its value in just 4 years. That is catastrophic to people who are savers or on fixed income, et cetera. So if you want to talk about alternative measures, though, for inflation was much, much worse. I mean, we're talking exceeding 30%. Now, this has to do with measuring not just the price of the basket of goods that the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts together for something like the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, but this has to do with a true cost of living measurement. So we're going to include in this, for example, the cost of what would be considered an investment, like buying a home. We're going to include fluctuations in interest rates, because not only did we have the fastest increase in prices in 40 years, we had the fastest increase in interest rates in 40 years. So This is a bit of a long-winded answer here, Jason, but I want to make the point that, again, inflation is difficult to measure. Just going by the official government metrics doesn't capture the true increase in the cost of living, nor do I think it measures the true devaluation of the dollar that we have seen over the last several years. So at a bare minimum, I think the official government metrics, a bare minimum, you can say 21 or 22%. But in reality, if you want to look at what has happened to the average American's ability to afford daily life, it has gotten much, much worse than that. And as just one piece of evidence, even if you want to stick with quote unquote official government metrics, we can look at something like the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta's home ownership affordability monitor index. And what that shows is that for the median income today, the median household income, to afford the median price home, it takes about 60% of your take-home pay. Now, yes, this is a national average here, so it's going to vary market to market. And if you want to check out that tool on the Atlanta Fed's website, they break it down by all different kinds of markets, metro areas and whatnot, by states. And the fact is that home ownership affordability today is at the lowest level in that index's history. So again, that puts into perspective, I think, just how bad the last 4 years have been, regardless of whatever kind of numbers the left wants to throw out.
And John Williams, to add your points there, John Williams of Shadow Government Statistics, he calculates the consumer price index using the old government formulas from the 1980s and the 1990s, and he had the real inflation rate at one point. I think it was early 2022. It hit just under 19%. It got to like 18.3 or 18.4. That was the annualized inflation rate.
Exactly. So that's where you have that overlap between inflation still being very, very high, the monthly inflation rates, and even the obviously then the annual inflation rates. So prices are going up very, very quickly, but you're also just getting into the Fed's interest rate hike cycle. So now you're getting that double whammy, right? And that is something
do you think, though, that
methodology. I'm sorry?
I was actually going to ask you if you think that raising interest rates actually kills inflation, because I mean, the Keynesian one is that it kills demand destruction, but it actually doesn't help on the supply side.
It's a very, very good question. So what the Fed does today, we talk about the Fed setting interest rates. There's really only one or two interest rates that the Fed actually sets. All the other rates they try to influence. So obviously the Fed sets the discount rate, because that's the rate when banks go to the discount window to borrow directly from the Fed tells them the interest rate they're going to have to pay for that. But outside of that, there really aren't a lot of interest rates that the Fed has the power to directly control. Even their key interest rate, what we call the Fed funds rate, that is something that they don't directly control. They influence. How do they influence it? By buying and selling securities. They try to influence that rate by taking liquidity out of the system or injecting liquidity in. And they do this literally on a daily basis in order to try to keep the rate that banks are charging each other for short-term loans. They want to keep it in a fairly tight window. So what the Fed basically did when they hiked rates very quickly was they had to change their market operations in order to again have that influence on rates. In terms of killing inflation, look, at the end of the day, what the Fed needs to do is get more money out of the system. They created inflation by adding so much liquidity. Now they need to get the money back out. Unfortunately, that's not what they're doing. So, I understand the argument from a supply side perspective that those higher interest rates are really killing the productive capacity of the economy because it chills investment so much. But the bigger problem, I think, is the fact that over the last several years, and this is something that really began with Ben Bernanke, but over the last several years, the Fed has been creating a bifurcated interest rate environment where they are making moves to try to reduce the interest rate charge to the Treasury. In other words, pull down yields on Treasury bills, bonds, and notes, but at the same time, they're pushing up the interest rate on the private economy, on private sector borrowing. So this is being done to still provide the Treasury with all the money they want to spend, but at the same time, they're making all of the burden fall, or most of the burden, I should say, fall on the backs of the private sector. They're doing this through a couple different mechanisms, paying interest on reserves, for example, reverse repurchase agreement operations. Essentially, what's happening here, Jason, is the Fed, when they create money for the Treasury to spend, that actually has very little inflationary impact. The much bigger inflationary impact is when the Treasury turns around and spends that money, and now the money is in the private economy, and it ends up in the banking system, and it multiplies. And so the first dollar that the Fed created for the Treasury to spend ends up adding a total of about $10 in total liquidity. And so about 90% of the inflationary impact comes after the Treasury spends that money. And that's yet another reason why we didn't see a huge spike in inflation right when Biden took office and started he started signing multi-trillion-dollar spending bills. Inflation didn't peak until 18 months thereafter. So by short-circuiting that mechanism, by essentially allowing the Treasury to spend money, but then siloing or sidelining, or what you might say is sterilizing that money, the Fed is preventing about 90% of the inflationary impact in the economy. That's what they've been doing with things like paying interest on reserves, with conducting reverse repurchase agreement operations. At one point, just from reverse repos alone, they were sidelining $2.5 trillion in liquidity. That was all money that, again, they had given to the Treasury. The Treasury had spent, but was being kept out of the private economy. So again, you're giving all this money to the Treasury to spend and to borrow, but then you're preventing the private sector from getting access to that same liquidity. Yes, it's helping to reduce the inflationary impact of all that government spending and all that money creation, but it's also strangling the loanable funds market, at least the private loanable funds market.
And they call that crowding out. That's the technical term, right?
You could throw this into the crowding out category. Really, I think when we talk about crowding out, Jason, we're talking about the phenomenon of when the government is going out and borrowing $2 trillion a year, like they are right now. That obviously is capital that's not going to be available for the private sector to borrow. And so now the private sector has to compete, and they have to compete by offering a higher interest rate. That's the price of loanable funds. So that, I think, is more the mechanism of crowding out. I think you could say, though, the Fed is basically trying to cheat that whole crowding out mechanism and not have any of that increased competition fall on the back of the Treasury. Instead, it's all going on the private market.
How much do you think bad energy policies and waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse that we're seeing with DOGE finding, $20 billion stolen and money wasted on the energy spending grift, how much do you think that contributed to inflation for everyday Americans over the last 4 or 5 years?
Well, I have no doubt that DOGE is going to end up finding $1 trillion or more in abuse, in fraud, in waste throughout this budget. So when you think about it as when you think of inflation, I should say, as a hidden tax, because that's fundamentally what it is. It's a transfer of wealth from the people to the government, and there is no better definition of a tax than that, at least none I've come across. Any government spending, right, is going to help fuel inflation. And so if you can reduce that government spending, whether it's by reducing fraud or reducing any other payment, you're going to help have a very positive impact on inflation. And that means that all of that fraudulent spending that we've had over the last several years has been fuel on the inflationary fire. So again, I'm very, very optimistic they're going to find a tremendous amount of more fraudulent spending, and we're going to be able to cut that spending because of the efforts of DOGE. Now, in terms of energy, though, to get to that part of your question, energy affects the price of everything we do and everything we buy, because energy is an input throughout this economy. I mean, every product and every service you want to bring to market takes energy in one way, shape, or form. But there are certain inputs like synthetic fertilizer, which is almost the only kind of fertilizer that we use today in modern farming, that is not even made from oil anymore. It's synthesized from natural gas. And so if you can bring down the price of something like natural gas, you're going to have an incredibly positive impact on agricultural, on the price of agricultural inputs, including fertilizer, and now you're going to have a tremendously positive impact on food prices at the grocery store. So you can bring down prices in a variety of ways by reducing the cost of so ubiquitous an input as energy. Throw bad energy mix into the mix, throw bad energy policy into the mix of the catastrophic levels of government spending we've had over the last several years, and you really have a 1-2 punch for high energy prices and high prices throughout the economy. What the Biden administration did, when you look at energy policy, they gave all these subsidies to failed experiments in solar, in wind. They imposed additional taxes on reliable sources of energy like domestic coal, oil, and gas. And then they also played a lot of games, though, with, I guess you could call it regulatory red tape, where they might in cases where there was already a lease, they would then deny a permit, or vice versa, knowing full well that people need both to produce. Or they'd allow you to explore an area. They'd even allow you to drill in an area, but heaven forbid you want to create a pipeline to take your product away and bring it to market. No, 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 they weren't going to allow that. So I think it's pretty easy to see once you start, again, digging into the details of all the regulatory red tape and the burdensome roadblocks that they threw into place, they were doing everything they could to stifle energy production. And that's why rig count pretty steadily fell under the Biden administration. And that's despite production going up, because as energy prices went up, especially in, I guess it was 2022, that made it profitable to produce a heck of a lot more. And again, even as well count went down, producers were able to make existing wells much more efficient and to squeeze every last drop or every last cubic foot of oil or gas, respectively, out of their existing wells. And so that's what we saw. We saw technological improvements that led to increased production.
Well, also buying oil from Iran and Venezuela is not a good idea. I mean, that funds those governments to do a bunch of nefarious things. And it would have been smarter from the U.S. economy and from a jobs perspective to actually allow our industry to continue to develop.
That's exactly right. And one of the things that people forget when we talk about the whole conflict in the Ukraine and Russian sanctions, which have been a total just absolute catastrophic failure, by the way. Russian manufacturing is doing far better now than they were before those sanctions were put in place. The ruble, everyone thought it was going to collapse against the dollar. No, it's doing just fine. One of the things that we could have done that would have been much, much more effective at really hamstringing the Russian war machine would be to simply just drill the snot out of this place. We should be drilling, we should be mining, and we should be exporting American energy around the globe. What's happened with the European Union is that they have given more money to Russia than they have to the Ukraine, because they have bought so much Russian energy over the last several years that it has far exceeded any of the aid that they have given to the Ukraine. And now we're finding out with every day that goes by, more and more of the aid that we have been giving to the Ukraine has actually just been essentially stolen by the oligarchs there, right? It's being spent fraudulently. It's not even being spent on military preparedness or arms or whatever the case may be. So, had we been continuing on the path of increased energy production that we were on under President Trump during the first administration, we'd be producing millions of more barrels of energy of oil per day and many, many more millions more cubic feet of natural gas. And those aren't even my estimates. Those aren't my numbers. That was done by a University of Chicago economics professor who determined that. So I agree 100%, Jason. One of the best things we could do to punish our enemies abroad, like Iran, to punish a nation like Russia or other bad actors around the world, would simply be to produce more energy here at home and to drive the price of that energy below those foreign nations' cost of production. And I would throw into that cost of production the financing of terrorists in Iran, the financing of the military in Russia.
Yeah, and then Venezuela had a bunch of crazy policies too. So I mean, like they were funding the enemies. The energy policies the Biden administration did were absolutely wacky. Tons of money was wasted, waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse. I mean, like Social Security was raided for a bunch of stuff. There was a hotel rooms in Chicago. I want to ask you though about the jobs reports. So have you, since you're a PhD economist and you've been doing this a long time, have you ever seen that many revisions? What, 18 months, every single month, the jobs reports were just revised downwards enormously. Have you ever seen anything like that before?
Not when there wasn't something wrong with the data. And look, it's very hard to estimate these kinds of things, like the total number of jobs in the country or the total number of people employed. All of these different statistics. That's why they're subject to revisions. They're not only subject to those monthly revisions, but where let's say January's data gets published, and then in the February and in the March reports, January can get revised as better data comes in. But then we also have an annual revision that's done many months later. So it's not as if it's out of the ordinary to have revisions. What is unusual, though, is when they're large and they're all in the same direction, because that means that your initial estimates are clearly very far off. There's something wrong with your methods or methodology here. There's something wrong with the data itself. And so you have to ask, okay, what's going on there? I think there's actually pretty reasonable explanations for what's wrong with the data. And so I don't think it's so much that there's someone at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, let's say, who's cooking the books, who's purposely putting out fraudulent numbers. What I think is actually going on, Jason, is you have a lot of changes in the economy after 2020. And those changes in the economy render many of the assumptions that pre-exist the pandemic, they render those assumptions erroneous. And that means that you need to develop new assumptions that better reflect the economic realities of today. I'll give you just one real quick example. When people start businesses today compared to before the pandemic, the odds of those businesses being successful, surviving, let's say, more than a year, those odds have gone down pretty tremendously. In fact, if you just file a business application today, the odds of that business ever getting started at all have gone down. Even if your business is successful, the odds of that business employing a large number of people are way down. The odds of that business employing anyone other than the sole proprietor are way down, the business founder. So things have clearly changed, right? But if you're going to make estimates for the number of jobs in the economy, and you have to try to figure out how many businesses in a particular month are being created and how many businesses are being destroyed. In other words, how many firms are going out of business. That's not enough. You also need to figure out how many jobs are being lost by the firms going out of business and how many jobs are being created by the firms that are being created. And if your estimates are off, in other words, if your assumptions are off, how many people are employed at a business that is either created or destroyed, your number of jobs that you estimate are added or lost in the economy for a given month can be way off. And that's one of the problems that we've been facing. Now, there are others, right? But that is just one of many ways in which the economy has changed and in which our estimates for the jobs numbers have also changed. The problem is those changes are not being reflected in our quote unquote official statistics. And the scandal, I think, is not so much that someone is purposely cooking the books. It's that these problems were clearly evident in the statistics in the spring of 2022. And so by, let's say, the end of 22 or maybe even the spring of 23, that's when the alarm bells should have been going off in everyone's minds that there is something wrong with our numbers. We need to reevaluate our methods and methodologies. And the scandal is that no one has done that. The scandal is that despite there clearly being something wrong with the data, I don't care if it favored Biden or if it disfavored him, doesn't matter. At the end of the day, something is wrong with the numbers and no one has done anything to correct it. That's a problem.
You're referring to the birth death model, right? Where the model assumes that for every job that's destroyed, someone's going to go out and try to create a new business or a new job?
Right, right. So we basically assume in that birth death model that as one firm goes out of business, another one is created. And so the jobs lost are simply replaced by jobs gained elsewhere. And in reality, that has not but been what we have observed, especially when we look at private sector data.
Yeah, and also like I think like the jobs reports in the past, I mean, don't they count like part-time jobs the same as full-time jobs? Because it seems like in reality, the real economy, a lot of companies are hiring people seasonally. They're hiring part-time jobs. They're not hiring as many full-time employees.
Right. This has been another really big problem. So when we look at the household survey, where we actually ask people within households, what kind of job, if you're employed, what kind of job do you have? And what we find there increasingly are people losing full-time jobs. We've just been absolutely hemorrhaging full-time jobs in the economy for well over a year now. And they're replacing those full-time jobs with part-time work. And the issue that you just mentioned, the lack of a distinction between full and part-time work, that is in the establishment survey, where we simply ask businesses, how many people do you have on the payroll? And that's where we can get into double counting, because if I lose my full-time job at Walmart and I have to go get a part-time job at Home Depot and a part-time job at Target, a part-time job at my local restaurant, whatever the case may be. Now there are three different businesses who will get surveyed and who will respond that, yes, we have somebody working here, right? There's a payroll that has been filled. So Walmart loses one, the other three gain one. It shows up in the aggregate statistics as +2 in terms of the number of jobs. And so as people continue to have to replace full-time work with multiple part-time jobs, that's creating this double counting phenomenon. We also actually see the same thing, Jason, when we look at self-employment and people who are self-employed, but they don't have an incorporation, right? A lot of people who do consulting work as their bread and butter fall into this category. They don't have an incorporation, right? Or they don't have a corporation set up, so they're not incorporated, and so they're never included in that establishment survey. So again, as they lose that self-employment and then they have to go work for another business, especially if it's part-time and they're taking on multiple gigs, that feeds into that whole double counting phenomenon as well, because they're moving from a kind of employment that previously was not surveyed into a new kind of employment that is surveyed. So you haven't actually changed the number of people employed, but you've increased the number of jobs.
Well, plus, like Trump and DOGE are trying to get the amount of U.S. federal government employees down, or maybe they weren't even working; they were just collecting a check. So they're trying to make sure incentivize the private sector to invest and create new jobs there instead of the government employees.
Yes, yeah. Getting the federal work count down is going to be a huge, huge boon to the American economy for a couple of reasons. One is, let's be frank, there's virtually no one in the public sector who's doing anything productive, who's adding anything to the real economy. And so if all those people lose those jobs and then go out and get jobs in the private sector, they will be doing productive work. And so even if they're getting paid more, let's say, they go from being a net loss on society to a net gain. I think that's a great thing. It's not that we want people to suffer, right? It's not that we want people to lose their jobs and to, not know where their next meal is coming from. Far from it. I want those people to be productively employed in the private sector. The other thing is that many federal employees, not only are they not doing anything productive, they're doing things that are counterproductive. There was one study I saw just recently, Jason, that shows that every single federal regulator costs the economy tens of millions of dollars per year. And so if you fire one of those regulators, I don't care if you fire them, but you put them on essentially paid leave for the rest of their life, and you pay them $100,000 a year plus another $100,000 in benefits and whatever other packages they get. That is still a net gain to the economy, because the work they were doing was costing us tens of millions of dollars a year. And now that work, thank God, is no longer being done.
Well, unfortunately, I think a lot of the GDP calculations, don't they count all government spending? It's counted the same as consumer spending, private sector investment with the Keynesian cross. So I would argue that government spending in many cases should not be counted as positive towards the GDP numbers.
Jason, you bring up a great point, and this is a big reason why the GDP statistics under Biden were not at all a reflection of how the average American was really doing in that economy. Because if you look at what the average American brought home per week, right, their weekly paycheck, and you compare that to prices, even if you use official government statistics for prices, which, as we mentioned earlier, really understate the problem. But even if you do that, you see that they lost purchasing power. Their larger paycheck at the end of 4 years bought about 4 or 5% less. And so you can't tell me that in a world where people are worse off, where their standard of living is down and their cost of living is up, you can't tell me that this exploding GDP figure reflects reality. And part of that has to do with what you just mentioned, the fact that we're counting government spending, what we should really call government purchases, that we're counting that as an addition to the economy. The reason I distinguish between government spending and government purchases is that much of what we look at as private consumer spending or private investment is actually government spending. Because if the government takes a dollar from you, Jason, and they give it to me to spend, and I go out and I buy something with it, we don't count that as government spending. We count that as private consumer spending. Now, if you dig into the private spending numbers, you will find a category in there on the income side that shows transfer payments. And that has been absolutely exploding and has accounted for more and more of GDP. So if we look at, okay, how much is government giving to the private sector to spend, whether it's consumer spending or on the investment side, and then we add up government purchases as well, you find it's a growing share of the economy. And unfortunately, like I just said, it causes these statistics like GDP to grow and grow and grow, even though it doesn't actually represent an increase in the size of the real productive economy. It doesn't represent an increase in people's quality of life or their standard of living.
Do you think that there's political motivations for the Atlanta Fed releasing their projections, for a minus 3% GDP estimate? Because based on what the government spending that you said, they're counting that positively towards GDP. Why do you think that they're releasing a negative GDP estimate going forward?
Well, a lot of that has to do with frankly, the lousy economic data that we've gotten the last couple of weeks. Now, lousy in the sense of its contribution to GDP, but in the same way that that government spending adds to GDP, and that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. When we look at something like how international trade is calculated, imports have exploded the last couple of months. The trade deficit in December was the biggest ever. January, if we look at the advanced economic indicators from the Census Bureau, it shows imports again absolutely exploding. So we should set another record there. Imports subtract from GDP. Exports add, but imports subtract. And so as we get these huge spikes in imports, that represents a negative contribution to GDP. To put in perspective, international trade in the month of January, if that trend continues, which it's unlikely to, but if that trend were to continue, it would subtract about 3 percentage points from the first quarter GDP figure, which is a lot. Right? You're basically wiping out all of the gains in consumer spending and then some. So why are imports spiking? Why are we seeing this change in international trade? Some of it has to do with the fact that prices around the world were exploding in the month of January. And so when we look at these advanced economic indicators, they're adjusted for seasonality, but they're not adjusted for prices. So we're not looking at things in inflation adjusted or in real terms, which is how they will ultimately appear in the GDP report. So there's something to take into consideration there. But the bigger component here, Jason, is that it looks like people are trying to front run tariffs. In other words, people are increasing their imports now in order to not have to face higher prices when tariffs are put in place, this month or next month, whatever the case may be. So that probably is having an impact there as well. But the other thing we're seeing is that if we look at, for example, January, the consumer spending numbers, it's from a report called Personal Income and Outlays from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. What we find there is those transfer payments that we just mentioned have absolutely plunged in the month of January. And so that means that there's a lot less money getting spent by the consumer because there are fewer government checks going out.
Are you talking like for government checks? Are you talking about like government employee salaries? Or are you talking like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, EBT cards, those types of things?
Yeah, so any money that the government is giving to you in payment for work, that falls under the income side. The transfer payments, however, where that comes into the equation in terms of a lot of the things you just mentioned. Anytime the government gives you a check for literally anything other than work, so it could be in the form of food stamps, it could be Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, rent assistance, a whole host of other programs, you name it. Those are all these government transfers, and so what we're basically seeing is as the brakes get slammed on there, you're going to see a huge negative impact on the consumer spending side as well. Now, that's not to say that that's bad. That's actually a good thing, right? We just talked about how the GDP numbers have been artificially inflated for years. You are now going to have to go through a deflation process. But just because the GDP numbers look bad doesn't mean it's a sign that people's lives are getting worse. Just like for the last 4 years, increasing GDP didn't mean people's lives were getting better. So I'm going to be paying attention to a lot of other statistics that I think better represent reality. That would include how much people are getting paid and what that income can actually buy.
Yeah, I agree. I think an important point there is people's cost of living. So if the price of gasoline is coming down, their grocery bill is coming down, the everyday living expenses, they have more purchasing power. That would be more beneficial than a higher GDP number, which doesn't really benefit most Americans. Maybe it makes the stock market, their retirement portfolio, the stock market go up. But other than that, I mean, their everyday expenses were not benefiting from a higher GDP number.
That's exactly right. And even the high stock market, you have to remember that once you adjust that for inflation, and again, like we said, there are lots of different ways to measure inflation, so there's lots of different ways to adjust for inflation. But let's say you adjust the S&P for something like the price of gold. The S&P is basically flat over half a century. I mean, that's insane. But it just goes to show you how inflation over the last several years has wiped out so many of these paper gains in equities. And then you throw into that things like the bond market, which under Biden had its worst 3.5 year run in literally 100 years. And that has absolutely devastated people's retirements and savings, investments, you name it. It's sad, but a lot of people who were planning on being retired right now are going to have to continue working for many years in order to recoup the inflation adjusted losses that they have suffered in their retirement accounts. So, again, it's very sad. It's unfortunate, but it's important to recognize, I think, where we are today.
Is it fair to say that Trump inherited from the Democrats in Congress and the Biden White House what a lot of stagflation? It sounds like misallocations of capital, government waste, fraud, corruption, abuse, and then a lot of stagflation that he has to try to clean up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's eminently fair, Jason. Very well put. Again, one of the problems when we look at things like GDP is it can give us these false readings of either things being better or worse than they really are, even if in the long term it tends to track well with actual production within the economy, with actual standard of living. But at the end of the day, when we dig through much broader data. We don't just look at one government statistic. We look at all kinds of private sector data. What we find is the exact same thing. We find stagnant growth and higher prices with the stagflation that you just mentioned. And unfortunately, since the Fed cut interest rates in the fall, in what I think was a blatant move of election interference, but regardless of their motivation, since they did that, the annual inflation rate has been increasing each month. So We are by no means out of the woods when it comes to inflation. We're still running multi-trillion-dollar deficits. We still are seeing M2 grow, not shrink. Inflation is not behind us, and the stagnant economic growth is not behind us either. That's all been dumped in President Trump's lap, as you said.
So he's trying to cut government spending. A lot of it's interest payments on the debt. He's trying to get that down. He's trying to improve the private sector with job growth and investment, and then he's focusing on energy prices. Are those kind of the main pillars that he's focusing on?
Yeah, absolutely. He's trying to spur economic growth in the private sector by decreasing taxes, by decreasing regulation. He's trying to, and also with tariffs, right? That's kind of the carrot and stick approach. He's telling people, look, if you re-onshore production here to the United States, if you make it in America, if you employ Americans, then you're gonna essentially face the best business environment in the world. That means lower taxes. That means lower regulation. But also, here's the stick. That was the carrot. This is the stick. If you don't do that, if you keep engaging in this corporate inversion, if you keep your production overseas and you import stuff here, then you're going to face a tariff. So there's that. But yeah, he's also going to increase energy production. That'll, like we said earlier, that'll have a tremendously positive impact. Get the government spending down. I was so happy to hear him hammer on getting the budget balanced. That would be the first time in what, 30 years since we've had a balanced budget. But getting the government spending down is key because it helps reduce the crowding out that you mentioned earlier, Jason, helps relieve pressure on the loanable funds market. That'll bring down interest rates, not just on government debt, which will reduce the financing costs on the debt, reduce those interest payments. Now there's more money left over after the budget is balanced to help pay down the debt itself. But you also reduce that crowding out. That'll bring down interest rates in the private market on everything, whether it's credit cards, student loans, auto loans, mortgage rates, right? So if you can get prices down on homes and at the same time reduce the interest rate on the mortgages that people use to borrow money for those homes, that would be just a total salve to this very, very wounded housing market that we're dealing with today.
And I had the budget deficits right before Biden left in 2024 around $3 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office was claiming only $1.8 trillion. I don't believe their numbers. The Congressional Budget Office tends to be wrong on a lot of their estimates. I think they said that it would take to 2030 for the U.S. national debt to get to 40 trillion. I mean, it's going to get there a lot faster than that with the mess that Trump has to try to clean up.
Yeah, unfortunately, everything when Trump took office was moving in the wrong direction. I think things are moving in the right direction now, but look, momentum is an incredibly powerful force, especially in economics. And so Trump is really trying to stop a freight train here and put it in reverse. It's going to take a lot of effort, and unfortunately, it's going to take some more time to really make that happen. Again, all of the effort is being exerted in the right direction, but it's going to take time to reverse all the terrible momentum that we have right now. And you're right, CBO has just time and time again been wrong on so many things, on so many of these numbers. So let's not even talk about the estimates of what we think is going to happen in the future. Let's look in the rearview mirror and look at what is already in the books, what we can definitively say has happened. Biden handed Trump the worst start to a fiscal year ever. So the fiscal year started in October, November, December, January. It was the worst start to a fiscal year ever when we look at the deficit. We've never had a deficit this big in the first 4 months of the year. And by the way, that includes the fiscal year that started in October of 2020. So October, November, December, and January. And let's not forget, during that time, you still had the outrageous blowout spending bills during COVID, right? During the pandemic year of 2020 and into 2021. So it's not as if, this is the biggest ever compared to a period of non-emergency. No, this is the biggest deficit we have ever seen. Again, it even eclipses the same time from when we had all the outrageous spending during 2020. So Trump's being handed a mess. That's the only way to put it. He's being handed an absolute cluster dumpster.
And then you see the op-eds. I think it was a Democratic senator, Connecticut, or one of those, try to blame inflation on Trump. I mean, he's been in the White House a month. This is a mess here with the size of the budget deficits, how quickly the national debt grew. What wasn't around eight? Correct me if I'm wrong. Around $8 trillion of government spending last year in 2024. That number is absolutely insane. And there was a record amount of tax receipts that came in, and they still ran what around a 3 trillion budget deficit, despite the amount of tax receipts that came in.
Yeah, this is part of part of the irony here with the Trump tax reform being passed when it did, is that it increased tax revenue in the subsequent years, but each year that went by, it had more and more of an impact on the economy, and that makes sense, right? It takes time for business to adjust to a new tax environment, and consumers too, although they'll adjust quicker usually. But whatever the case, Biden got to reap a lot of the benefits of the Trump tax reform in terms of increased investment within the economy and faster growth and higher tax receipts. And so he got record tax receipts. And yet, because they overspent so much, he still exploded the deficit. And not only did they explode the debt, but on top of that, they ran down the Treasury's cash balance by $1 trillion. And so if you look at the total overspending, how much the debt went up and how much Treasury cash went down, it was about $9.4 trillion. That has never happened before in any 4-year term, or actually even an 8-year term, I don't think, where an administration managed to overspend by almost $9.5 trillion. That is truly staggering. And again, it speaks to the absolute mess that has been dumped in Trump's lap.
Is that more on a percentage basis than what was the U.S. government spent what during World War II spending or right after World War II?
That's a good question. I do know that outside of some kind of national emergency, whether that's war, or even a recession, or even if you want to say a pandemic like COVID, whatever the case may be, outside of some kind of national emergency on a percentage basis, we have never had deficits this large, whether it's the deficit as a percentage of GDP, whether it's a deficit as a the deficit relative to tax receipts. I don't want to say as a percentage of tax receipts, but I guess that would mathematically be true too. So by a whole variety of measures, we have never had, again, on a percentage basis, we have never had deficits this large before outside of some kind of a national emergency.
Well, EJ, I want to thank you so much for your time. I definitely want to have you back on in the not too distant future. You have a new article out in the last year or two, right, for the Washington Times?
Yeah, just published today, actually. Basically reflecting on the president's speech. I really just hit on the economic points. Obviously, there were plenty of other issues that he touched on as well, and that'll I know a lot of Americans agree with him on. But I really just stick to the economic focus of the speech.
Do you also have a newsletter or Substack?
I do not, but the best place to find me is going to be on Twitter or X. I keep calling it Twitter, but it's X. The handle there is @RealEJAntoni.
Well, thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and let's definitely have you back on.
Hey, my pleasure, Jason. Thank you for having me.